welcome everyone. My name is Nicole Porter. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project, and welcome to this webinar, which is going to be a discussion focused on a recent report that the Sentencing Project co-published along with the ACLU and Human Rights Watch. That report is called Out of Step, U.S. Voting Rights in a Global Context. And so we'll get into the context of the report after I welcome our panelists today. I want to give some opening comments here. And the fact that 2024, for those of us in the States, to no one's surprise, is a significant year when it comes to the vote, given that we are in a major presidential year in the United States. But in fact, more than 50 countries also are having major elections this year. That's home to more than half the planet's population in 2024. So the number of persons exercising the right to vote around the country isn't just an issue for the United States, but it's an issue for a range of nation states, from Russia to Taiwan to India to the United Kingdom, my apologies, to El Salvador and South Africa. And the presidential and legislative contest in these countries have huge implications for human rights, economic policy, as well as international relations and prospects for peace, given the political moment we're in, not just in the United States, but across the globe. The report that we'll speak to this afternoon and the advocacy conversation that we'll also engage in is going to speak to the fact that the United States is out of step with the rest of the world when it comes to stripping voting rights from people living with felony conviction history solely on the basis of their criminal conviction. And as a matter of fact, as of 2022, over 4.4 million people in the United States remain locked out of voting, disenfranchised from voting because of a felony conviction. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to give some context to the background on that in the recent report that, again, the Sentencing Project co-published with Human Rights Watch and the ACLU. And we're going to talk about what we're doing to resist that and move democracy forward through democracy organizing and democracy advocacy, not just in the United States, but across the globe, given our relationship in collaboration with transnational activists. And we have guests here from Europe today, but we also are working with folks in South America and across the world who are also engaged in the fight for justice and human rights. So thank you all for joining us. Let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. We are welcomed by Mr. Checo Yancy out of Louisiana, who is a founding member of VOTE, that is Voters Organized to Educate, and who is policy director of the organization's sister organization that works on C4 advocacy in the state of Louisiana. Based in Baton Rouge, Checo works alongside the Department of Corrections and the legislature, laying the groundwork for formerly incarcerated people like himself to strengthen their capacity to fight for their rights, their civil rights, and their human rights. And I've had the honor of knowing Mr. Yancy for many years, and he is an elder advocate in the movement in the fight for justice in the United States. So welcome, Checo. We're also joined by Jennifer Schroeder, who was sentenced to 1 year in jail and 40 years of probation. That is not a misstatement, 40 years of probation in the community for a drug offense in 2013. After her release from jail, she graduated from college with a degree in addiction counseling. She went on to become an activist and was the lead plaintiff in 2 Supreme Court cases represented by the ACLU, challenging the constitutionality of banning persons with felony convictions from voting. And she played a major role in moving legislation of restoring the right to vote to nearly 50,000 Minnesotans and other advocacy, including the Clean Slate Bill. Checo and Jennifer's experiences are documented in the Out of Step report, and we are grateful to have their participation in today's conversation. We're also joined by Carolina Nascimento, who holds a degree in international studies from the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil and a master's degree in political science from École Normale Supérieure. I am so sorry. Carolina, I'm like the worst person when it comes to trying to perfect non English words. So I apologize for butchering the pronunciation of some of your affiliations. But what it is important to recognize is that we are welcomed by Carolina, who's joining us from across the Atlantic from France. And Carolina is a part of the Prison Insider team and has worked there since 2018. She is a Brazilian national and has traveled extensively for academic and professional purposes, and through Prison Insider has been able to document practices of people incarcerated in countries across the world, including those in places beyond the borders of the United States. And we welcome Carolina to this conversation because she and I were in direct contact over the many months as we were preparing for the publication of the Out of Step report to figure out a way to include the voices and perspectives of incarcerated people in other parts of the world who are voting. And so there are people whose experiences who voted while incarcerated from Brazil and also from France who are included in the Out of Step report that the Sentencing Project co-published along with Human Rights Watch and the ACLU. Again, my apologies to you, Carolina, for butchering the pronunciation of some of your affiliations, and I need to work on that. That's some personal work.
No worries.
And lastly, we are joined by Trey Walk, who is a co-author on the Out of Step report. Trey is a democracy researcher and advocate for Human Rights Watch's U.S. program. In this role, Trey documents and challenges threats to voting rights, access to truthful information, and civic engagement. And he collaborates with movements working to promote robust multiracial democracy in the United States. So I welcome our panelists, and after a few words that provide background on the report, we're going to get into a discussion. I want to invite those in the audience to use the Q&A function so that you can share your questions and your comments in the Q&A function. The chat tends to move fast, so we'll rely on that Q&A function when we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion this afternoon. And I see people in the chat sharing their names or affiliations. Welcome Kimberly, who's a longtime rights restoration activist, and welcome others who've joined and shared where you're calling in from as well. Continue to do that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to share a video that provides some additional background on the Out of Step report. No volume, Morgan.
Let's try one more time.
More than 4 million people can't vote in the United States because of felony convictions. This is known as felony disenfranchisement, and the way it's used in the US is way out of step with the rest of the world. After studying the laws of 136 countries, Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, and the Sentencing Project found that a majority never or rarely take away a person's right to vote because of a conviction. In the 63 countries we looked at, where the right to vote is sometimes denied, the US is still on the more restrictive end, impacting a bigger group of people. Only 5 other countries permanently take away the right to vote for some or all people with felony convictions, like 11 US states do. So how did the US end up here? Well, many of today's laws around felony disenfranchisement date back to the end of the Civil War, when slavery was abolished and Black men got the right to vote. But many states quickly passed laws expanding what was considered a felony in ways that targeted Black people. At the same time, states enacted laws that took voting rights away from anyone convicted with a felony. To this day, extremely high rates of incarceration in the US, and in turn, felony disenfranchisement laws, disproportionately impact people of color. 1 in 19 Black people of voting age are disenfranchised in the US. But there's hope. In the past couple of decades, 27 states have expanded voting rights for people with felony convictions and restored the right to vote for almost 2 million people. All states should follow suit and end felony disenfranchisement once and for all. People should be able to exercise their human right to vote regardless of their conviction history.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you to Human Rights Watch for publishing that video. It's a great backgrounder on the issue and also on the context related to the report itself. There's been some requests in the chat to share the link to the video. We'll make sure to do that. And also a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be shared to the Sentencing Project's YouTube page, and folks will be able to access it if they weren't able to log in or when the webinar is over. But with that, let's get into a discussion. And, again, we want to speak to the report and then also get into ways to advance voting rights and challenge the disenfranchisement that plagues the United States, the other countries that are highlighted in the report, and the advocacy that's happening right now. Trey, I want to turn to you to see what additional context you can offer given the out-of-step report.
Sure, happy to. And thanks, Nicole, for having us. And I'm really excited about this discussion. I feel like we got a great group assembled here to kind of get into what to make of the report. I think the video gives a good primer, but one thing I just maybe want to underscore is the reason that we felt like this report would be a useful tool for us. One of the things that's really important is the US, or a point of leverage for us is that the US often sort of talks about itself or thinks about itself as a leader in the world in terms of having a democracy, having a multiracial democracy. And there's been this long history of that democracy having a big stain on it. And it's that people are disenfranchised in this country. And so when you look at the list of countries that the US is similar to in terms of who disenfranchised, it's really sort of a shocking list. One thing that our report decided not to focus on was the sort of quality. We weren't sort of evaluating the quality of each democracy, but we were looking specifically at the laws and practices around disenfranchisement. So like the video said, we looked at 136 countries, all of whom had populations over 1.5 million people, and found that the majority of them don't ever remove the right to vote because of a conviction. The ones that do so rarely, and so the U.S. is on the extreme end. When you look through the report, one thing that'll be interesting is there are other countries who have really strong language and defense about why they don't remove the right to vote. One of the cases that I think we draw a lot of inspiration from was South Africa. In 1999, they had a court ruling that restored the right to vote. And there's this beautiful passage in it, and I'll just read a little bit of it, which says universal adult suffrage on a common voter roll is one of the foundational values of our entire constitutional order. The universality of the franchise is important not only for nationhood and democracy, but the vote of each and every citizen. It's a badge of dignity and personhood. Quite literally, it says that everybody counts. And in a country of great disparities of wealth and power, it declares that whoever we are, whether rich or poor, exalted or disgraced, we all belong to the same democratic nation, that our destinies are intertwined in a single interactive polity. And there's some beautiful justifications from South Africa, but other countries who in recent years have moved towards expanding the right to vote. So Uganda and Zambia in the last couple of decades have permanently ended felony disenfranchisement. There are countries that have limited the amount of years that the right to vote can be taken away for felony conviction, or what the equivalent is in those countries. Then many countries like Chile, Croatia, and Kenya who have taken steps to make it easier for people to vote while they're incarcerated and be able to use their voting rights when they're in secure custody. And so there are lots of examples around the world that I think we can pull from, and we're hoping this report is kind of a useful resource. It's a talking point to kind of call the US out on its hypocrisy. If we want to be the leader of democracy or human rights in the world, what does it mean that we are one of the largest disenfranchisers? But also I think the report has a lot of good practices and sort of intermediate steps towards universal suffrage that might be useful for folks on this call and advocates around the country.
Thank you, Trey, for offering that context, that additional context for the report in addition to the video that was shared, and the link was shared in the chat, and we'll follow up with folks with these resources as well, not just the link to the report, but the video and other resources that are mentioned this afternoon. So, we want to turn to Checo and Jennifer, particularly as folks who survived felony disenfranchisement, Checo in Louisiana, Jennifer in Minnesota. One of the themes of the report is that many countries' laws hold the right to vote in extremely high regard, rarely removing people's right to participate in public life. And so from that, the United States could learn a lot here. And Trey mentioned South Africa. And it's interesting when you think about South Africa, that folks there worked to remake a country after many years of apartheid that was modeled after Jim Crow in the United States. And the question is, if you could start over, what would be the ideals? What would be the values to try to document and try to live up to within a country that's working to repair harm? South Africa has a long way to go, but certainly the framework that Trey read through helps to situate it far beyond where the United States is, even though the United States likes to claim it's a model of democracy. So with all of that, Checo and Jennifer, could you all share your experience with the audience of the activism you've been engaged in to claim your right to vote, given the disenfranchisement you were up against, but the activism you're currently thriving and leading on? And so Checo, I'll turn to you first and then to Jennifer.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's been a long, long road. I spent 20 years in Angola. I went to prison in 1983. And while in prison, a good friend of mine, Norris Henderson, worked in the law library. And we were reading through the law books and stuff, trying to find a way to get out of prison and everything. And we discovered that, having the right to vote is very, very important. We're trying to change the laws, trying to get our families involved. And we realized it's the folks that's elected that makes these decisions. So the thing about changing this is we got to get in step, because that's how you change the laws. And, when reading this report out of step, my thing is, if it was a line dance, everybody be stepping on somebody's toes, you know what I mean? Because you have these opposition folks that always moving the goalposts, always moving the goalposts. So approximately 37 years ago, we had an organization called the Angola Special Civics Project, which we educated our people and our families. And when they came to visit, we didn't want to talk about what's going on and everything. I love you. That come out with moms and stuff like that. But we were trying to teach our families how you can get involved. And the way you get involved, we're asking them to go to the judge, go to the attorney. We decided, hey, let's try a different approach. And the approach is educating our families and understanding that those people that are elected officials, they make the laws. So we decided, hey, let's do this. And our thing was educate, 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 and then you can organize, and then you can mobilize. And while in prison, we wrote our first law. We call ourselves knowing what to do, not realizing that it would take someone to introduce that to the legislature to get it through the committees. We had to learn all those things. So we did that, with the Angola Special Civics Project. We also had an organization called PIC, Partners in Correction, that some of the correctional officers got involved because they saw us doing stuff positive. And at one point, I remember the warden told us, y'all trying to take over my prison. And we were saying, we're trying to get out of prison. We're trying to do something positive. So along with the LCSPR, Louisiana Coalition in Support of Penal Reform. So we try to get the word out and get involved so we could find a way to do it. And we created our first law. Was back in those days, they had a term called criminal menopause. It meant that as you age out of crime, as you get older. So we tried to put together laws that would change parole eligibility. And by that, let me simplify it. By making everybody be accountable. And after you serve a certain amount of years and you get a certain amount of age, then you should be considered for parole. And we went with that, and we changed the law, and that's how we did it. And then later on, I'll get into how complicated it was once we got out to get our voting rights. But we had to get our families involved, as opposed to saying, baby, I love you and hugging and all that. Hey, read this, familiarize yourself with what's going on so we can make a difference and get our behind out of prison. But make sure you hold elected officials accountable. They have to be held accountable because when they come into our communities, they want to tell us what they're going to do for us. But once the election is over with, you never see them again. So we taught our people, have your elected officials on speed dial, know those people, educate yourselves. And then once you educate, organize, then you can mobilize people. And I have a lot more to talk about later, but because this is very personal to me, we'll talk about how we got our voting rights and we'll talk about that later. If that's okay. So Jennifer, latest.
Hi, thanks for having me. Well, it has been a very long journey. Let's see, I started because a college professor of mine brought us to a rally one night. This is after I was released from a year in custody and had been sentenced to 40 years of probation, which meant that I couldn't vote until I was 71 years old. And voting at that time was very important to me. I got really drawn into the voting. One of my first jobs that I ever had, our boss, this is when I was, barely able to vote, 18 years old, brought us all to vote. He let us get out of work. And, I at first just thought, oh, awesome, I can get out of work, but seeing the voting process and being a part of something, it was bigger than that. And I voted in the Bush-Gore election, and you can see how close elections can come and that your voice matters. So that was the foundation of the importance to voting to me. I was contacted by the ACLU of Minnesota somewhere along the lines to become a defendant or a plaintiff in a state versus case versus the Secretary of the State. That was a very long, it went through the courts of appeals. It's went through all the way up to the Supreme Court, and kind of running in tandem with that, I was contacted by the House Majority Leader Jamie Long in Minnesota, who had heard my story and asked if I would come and testify down at the Capitol. So I began a long journey of testifying in front of the House and the Senate, and speaking to legislators and senators, and we even the commissioner of the DOC, we sat in on a sentencing guidelines commission table, and actually that's really how we got our foot in the door. Was we kind of snuck a vote in there and got a public hearing in front of everybody, and it was pretty cool. And yeah, so the Supreme Court did not rule in our favor, but they did not rule against us. It was kind of a win because the legislation had already passed the law, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. So now we are all restored here in Minnesota for the felons' right to vote, which is very cool.
Those are two examples of some of the reforms that have happened over the years. In fact, you can document back to 1997 when in Texas, then Governor Bush signed into law a measure that ended lifetime disenfranchisement in Texas. And that helped set off an era in which many states across the US expanded rights to people with felony convictions, ending lifetime disenfranchisement policies in some states, automatically restoring voting rights after incarceration in others, such as Minnesota and New Mexico last year. Some 60,000 people got their voting rights back in 2023. So that's significant. And we hope this year that best practices are being employed in order to guarantee their access to the ballot this election cycle. With all of that, the United States is what the report lays the foundation on, is literally out of step with other parts of the world, given the supposed democratic practices that the United States likes to claim itself adhering to, and values that it claims to be applying. So with that, I wanted to turn to you, Carolina, across the Atlantic, and ask you, given the report, given our engagement over the years, can you let us know and let the audience know how the US is understood in the international context? Could you start by telling us a bit how your observations on felony disenfranchisement or on voting rights for people who are incarcerated in France and Brazil measure up to the practices that you've been observing in other parts of the world?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. So thank you very much, Nicole, for the invitation. For us, it's very, very interesting and very important to be part of this discussion and to have reports like this one, because we're is also in the core of the work that we do, to be interested in the comparison of prison issues around the world. So having this kind of work is very out there is very important for the work that we try to promote at Prison Insider, to provide information, to have this access to information about what is happening and the legislation and also the practices around the world. So for the work that we do at Prison Insider and that I do in the information team, one of the things that we do is that we work with country profiles, and we have 17 countries profiles. And when you do a country profile, one of the questions we ask is, do incarcerated people have the right to vote? Because we really want to understand the legislation, but also if they have the right, is this right respected or not? So what we observed in the countries that we could examine in a more, let's say, deep manner with these country profiles, and is also very, and have a lot of echo with the work that you do with this report, is that actually, as we observed, in most of the countries, the restrictions are regarding the access, the voting rights for convicted people, for incarcerated people, are much rarer than in the US, in terms of they are more in specific for specific situations. For example, we recently worked on Turkish legislation, and we saw that when it's only for people who are sentenced for what they call the intentional offenses, they are disenfranchised. In countries as Lebanon, is more close to what we saw in different states of the US, where convicted people are not allowed to vote during the incarceration. It's the same as in Brazil. But in other countries, as in France, where we are based in, it's since 1994 that all prisoners can vote. The thing is that if the authorities wants to disenfranchise someone, is an additional sanction. It's not automatic with the conviction. You need to there's an additional sentence that restrict the civil rights of someone. This happens as you say. This number is much less than in US, in France, but it's still important for the context of France. Is around 32,000 people in France that are disenfranchised every year. But for the people who are in prison, most of them, actually, the majority, are allowed to vote. And the things that we saw is that it's more regarding the access to have this right respected. So in many countries, the same. For example, in Tunisia, we have similar legislation. There is more close to in Turkey or in Spain, where there's for a specific situation. Or for example, in Italy, is for people who are convicted for more than 3 years. But it's still a lot of also advocacy work going on in these countries to have to expand the right to vote for incarcerated people. And what we see what is going on in these countries more to how to make this right accessible. So in France, it's a very interesting case because it's very recent that there have been some changes, because before 2019, if someone, they had the right to vote while incarcerated, but if someone wants to vote, they have the possibilities that they have to do so. They had to ask for a permit to leave to go out and to vote. So this is very rare and difficult to access in France. And many people didn't want to use the full temporary release that they had to go to vote. So since 2019, they did like a test year in the election at the time, the European election at the time, to have the possibility to vote by post. And we saw the difference also later in 2022 with the change in the legislation, and they have from 2022 the right to do the vote by correspondence, by post in prison, that it changed the participation of people incarcerated, changed from 2% in 2017, in the French presidential elections in 2017, to 20% of participation, which is a big change when we compare, but it's still, you see a lot of people who are still not able to, or we don't understand yet if they don't want to participate, or also if there's a lot of disparities amongst facilities to really have this right to be respected.
Well, that is extremely helpful, Carolina, and the outcomes that you just specified there are critical to the conversations that we have in the United States around access, around guaranteeing ballot access for eligible voters who are incarcerated and who also may be in the community. So thank you for bringing that perspective to this conversation. And you went over several countries and their practices, the underlying policies, and focusing on the access to the ballot. And in the United States, we're having that conversation as well. We're having the conversation on expanding the franchise to people after incarceration, but also ending felony disenfranchisement outright. And one thing that the authors of the report hope is that it can be a tool for advocates, for people in the audience and others to really understand the policies, not just within the United States, but across the 139 countries that are compared in the report. So there's a chart, and I want to go back to Trey to see if you have any additional context or can speak to some of the information available in the report, given what Carolina surfaced and some of the recommendations and best practices around ballot access that are found in the report.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there are the countries that kind of fall in the category where we hope everyone eventually ends up, which is that they don't ever remove the right to vote to someone because of a criminal conviction. And then there are countries that have time-bound restrictions, so they may remove the right to vote during incarceration, but immediately upon release, those rights are restored. And then there's a set of countries that they might have a sort of time-bound restriction. So there are countries that for 2 years after release, someone's right to vote might be removed, or for 5 years after release. But largely countries have moved away from the permanent disenfranchisement model, the lifetime disenfranchisement model. So there's a time dimension, and then there's also countries we looked at who remove the right to vote as it relates to the specific offense, and it's sort of decided in the sentencing stage. So let's say someone was charged and convicted with an election-related crime, whether that's, maybe it's election fraud or charged with treason or something like that, then in those cases, the right to vote is removed, but the right to vote is not removed for any sort of criminal offense, whether it's someone writes a bad check or they have a drug possession charge or something like that. And in the US, the ways we link those two things, we found that to be very uncommon. In other countries, they sort of use it as they do a specific analysis oftentimes by a judge to determine whether that actually makes sense. And then that was another kind of pattern we found. There are countries that don't have blanket rules that people have their voting rights removed, but rather it's a individualized assessment by a judge or by a court during sentencing in a criminal conviction. And so what you can see is that there's a lot of steps kind of along the way, and the report talks about how the US is also has a patchwork model. There are some states that are on the freer end of the spectrum and don't remove the right to vote. A couple of states there, and then there are states that are on the more restrictive end of the spectrum. And so we kind of show how the countries fall in that line. And as you're saying, Nicole, hopefully people can kind of look at the chart and say, oh, this set of countries right here, they do this practice. This is what my state does, and how can we kind of move ourselves further in the right direction in terms of protecting the right to vote. Yeah, I hope that's helpful there.
Thank you, Trey. And then going back to the activists, well, we're all activists in some way or another, but going back to Jennifer and Checo, you know, given what we've heard from Carolina and Trey in terms of how the United States compares to other countries, even if there's like a range of practices, but the United States really is an outlier in disenfranchising people, you know, blankly just because of a criminal conviction status, and that results in over 4.4 million people who are disenfranchised as of 2022, although we do expect that will go down with the reforms mentioned earlier in New Mexico and Minnesota. But how can the reality in other parts of the world sort of be a North Star to the activism that we could be organizing around and coalescing around in the United States? How can, you know, what does this conversation look like in Louisiana and Minnesota in terms of ending felony disenfranchisement and guaranteeing access to the franchise for people regardless of conviction status, whether or not they live in the community or they're completing their sentence in prison, given observations from other parts of the world where people are actually voting while in custody? So what does that look like, and what could that look like for the campaigns, for the conversations playing out in your respective states of Louisiana and Minnesota? Jennifer, we'll start with you and then go to you, Checo.
I just wanted to say that to kind of piggyback off of what Trey was talking about, and share the language that the Supreme Court used in the findings. The Constitution says that felons are banned unless restored to civil rights. So that was where the wishy-washy kind of came in, and restoring people to civil rights. What does that mean is the conversation that I think needs to be had in order to further, let states to move on allowing felons to vote. I think that there needs to be conversations had with officials in each state, with top government officials. They're really the ones that are going to be able to change things. So if you're an activist, get down to your capital and start knocking on senators' doors and bugging them until they get sick of you. Share your story, be vulnerable. People that have these felony convictions, if the conversation is a little vulnerable, I think that people tend to listen to that a little more. So be vulnerable and get your story out there if you have one to share. The more people that start voicing their opinions on voting, the better it's going to get. I think that voting is one of those things that where you can come from any class, any creed, there's a lot of people in this country, and that one day where we go vote is even playing ground for everybody. I think that it's a really important thing for people to talk about. So, yeah.
Just jumping in, first of all, we had to change the language here in Louisiana. We're still having that problem. We don't say ex-con, we don't say offender. If someone is incarcerated now, it's a CIP, a currently incarcerated person. And if you're out, FIP, former incarcerated person. And we have to have that language with elected officials, because they like to use that offender and stuff like that. And offender means that something is going on. But back to the voting, it took us, we had a former state representative, Pat Smith. It took 5 years to get our voting rights. Each year we would go down to the legislature and we would testify in the Governmental Affairs Committee, and they would they were just denied. The committee just denied it. Pat would say, I'll be back. And finally in 2018, during my testimony and several other people's testimony, and the statement that I made, and you can go to our website, and they can put it up, www.voiceoftheexperience. My thing was that, hey, I will trade my voting rights if you say that I don't have to pay taxes, because taxation without representation that was a statement that because I was reading something, and that's what the Boston Tea Party, taxation without representation. And I never will forget the committee head, he kind of smiled, he said, Mr. Yancey, that might be a good deal. And that particular day, it passed out of the committee. And but we had to have some stipulations. You had to be out of prison if you was on parole, probation, but you had to be out 5 years. And then you had to get a certificate from probation and parole to bring it to the registrar's office. That was the start of what we had to do. But it took us 5 years to do that. But now we are actually advocating, and we just come out of a big conference. We had a FIP conference, Waking Up the Sleeping Giant, because right now we've identified over 70,000 former incarcerated people that are eligible to register to vote. So it's a hard thing, because guys and ladies have been told for so long, you don't have the right to vote. And I'll tell you a funny story. And in Louisiana, as opposed to counties, we have parishes. So way up in St. Helena Parish, this young man that we knew got out of prison, and he had his 5 years, and he got everything he needed, went to the registrar's office, and this white lady actually told him, boy, what you doing in here? And he was very polite. He said, I'm coming to register to vote. And she said, well, if you don't get your behind out of here, I'll call the sheriff. Ain't you on parole? And he called us and he said, hey, man, I don't want nothing to do with voting if that's what going back to prison. So we had to go to the Department of Corrections, go to the Secretary of State, at that time was Kyle Arden, and let them know, hey, this is very unfair. That guy has a right, so now you're going to, threaten him. What are you doing? And we had to change that. So this is very hard work. We have to convince guys that your vote does count. And we had a very interesting election here in Louisiana last year. That a black sheriff guy was running for sheriff, and one of the guys was a black guy. Guy won by 1 vote. They had a recount. Both of them got 3 votes. Guy still won by 1 vote. They took him to court. So what we did, vote, our organization, we put boots on the ground, because we understood how canvassing and letting folks know that this election is coming up, how important it is. And he had to win 3 times. This time he won by 4,000 votes. So when we're talking to people about your vote does count, when people tell me my vote ain't gonna count, man, they're gonna do what they want to do, then I have a scenario that I can tell them about. 1 vote. It takes 1 vote to get to 2. It takes 2 to get to 3. So each vote is important. And yeah, it's hard work, because some people just don't realize how important it is. So our thing is, we have to continue to understand, they have to, get involved. We all took civics in the 8th grade. And this country is run by the departments, the 3 departments, making sure the justice and everything, but you have to get involved. You have to teach people that your vote does count. Then you have to teach people that, hey, your neighborhoods could be better because your city councilman is your elected official. Your Betsy board, which is the Board of Education, teaches you, they're over your children. So everybody that wants to be elected, it's very important. Just don't vote at the top of the ballot. You have to vote the whole ballot, because right now in Louisiana, we're suffering. Now they want to come back because we're now super majority. We have a Republican governor, and he won by less than 500,000 votes and walked in. So he's a Republican and super majority, because we don't have now enough. Our House is 105 members, the Senate is 39 members, But in the House, we don't have 29 Democrats. And on the Senate side, we only have 11 Democrats. So that's why we teach people each one of these elections are very, very important. So you have to stay involved. And, you know, we're out of step. So we're trying to make sure we stay in step to educate people. When I'm out doing voter registration, and now the Secretary of State has now put it up that you have to register with them to register people. You know, it's just unbelievable that that oppression comes. And they don't call it oppression. They say, well, we're trying to get the laws together. But really, it's voter suppression. So, you know, I encourage anyone that's listening on today, you know, don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Keep fighting, because guess what? Taxation without representation is illegal. Thank you.
And
Well,
can I just say one more thing real
Sure.
quick? I have a feeling sometimes that it's not just what seems to be isn't always what seems to be. You know, we had in Minnesota a lot of opposition trying to get the restore the bill passed, or the restore the vote passed, and a lot of it fell back to politics. I mean, we had a lot of Republicans that didn't want the vote shifting to the Democratic favor, and they were worried about that. So it was getting pushed back a lot of times. And I can't say for certain that that's why they were, you know, kept rejecting it, but I have a feeling. And a lot of times you're going to meet opposition from things that you can't budge. And in Minnesota, it took, I think 20 years is when the Restore the Vote movement started in Minnesota. And it took a lot of people, a lot of boots on the ground, a lot of voices. And, you know, I just happened to be the one voice that might have pushed it over the edge there. But there was a ton of people before me that had tried. The politics is really unfortunate in this country, that we're not, that, you know, in some places that the government doesn't look at the people as we the people anymore. It's more we the government, what are we gonna, you know, and it's unfortunate, but I think that in Minnesota, at least, I can see it shifting into a much better direction. We have very good people in our offices right now that are all about social justice and have made some very big changes, but you got to just keep at it.
thank
You
you,
have to
Jennifer
keep
and
at it,
Checo.
right? Can I just say right quick? You have to keep at it, because we have a shout when we go to the Capitol, because we're teaching our people that each one of these committees, they're making the laws, your criminal justice committee, your governmental affairs. So we bring our people and we shout, whose house? Our house. The Capitol is our house. I mean, because you wouldn't be elected if that is our house. So we do that. And our other phrase that we do is no surrender, no retreat. And we holler that in the hallways, and we make sure that those elected officials know that our voice and our bodies, we are here and we ain't going nowhere. So we want to get them back in step to represent the people. That's what this is all about.
That is what this is all about. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to Q&A. And there's at least one question in the Q&A. I invite other folks to share their question or comment in the Q&A as well. But my last question to all of you is, you know, we started off this year starting off this hour, talking about the report, and then talking about 2024 as a year in which many countries, not just the United States, but many countries across the globe are having elections this year. So in some ways, this is a global year of democracy, a global year of participation in representative democracy. And I did want to offer some context around ending felony disenfranchisement. There are active efforts throughout the United States to get us a little bit closer to the step that guarantees the franchise for people, even those completing their sentence inside of prison. Active measures were introduced this year in Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts, and Illinois, and there are active coalitions in those states working to advance the ball. There's also pending federal legislation called the Inclusive Democracy Act that would end felony disenfranchisement for all persons, including those completing their felony sentence inside of state and federal prisons and federal elections. That act is sponsored on the House side by Representative Ayanna Pressley and on the Senate side by Senator Welch out of Vermont. And we encourage everyone who is an American resident to participate in civic engagement and reach out to those representatives in support of the Inclusive Democracy Act. But I'll ask this question before we go to the Q&A to folks in the audience. And again, want to invite people to share a question in the Q&A function in the webinar. And that is, given that 2024 could be called the year of democracy, what is the impact of guaranteeing the franchise for people completing their sentence, regardless of criminal conviction status, whether or not that's in the United States or beyond the US's borders? What could that mean for democracy to guarantee participation for everyone who might be impacted by the criminal legal system? And we want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to weigh in on this question. And we also want to reserve time for folks in the audience to get to their questions as well. So Caroline, I'm going to start with you to respond to that.
Yes, so as you say, the 2024 is a very important year for democracy, and also from the work that we do at Prison Insider is also an important year because we are doing something new. One of the biggest projects that we are doing since 2019, we finally have release it in December, which is a global index on prison conditions called the Prison Life Index, where we're going to evaluate country by country regarding the international standards to understand the respect of prisoners' rights, for the rights of people incarcerated. So one of the things that we that we try to evaluate in this Prison Life Index is the fact that people incarcerated are connected with the outside world. And one of the subcategories is called being connected with society. And what we see that is important for the importance for democracy is because when you see from the point of view of this work is because when we analyze the connection with society, we do this in two different ways. One is to see if people in prison have access to information, and another way is to check if people incarcerated have the access to vote, they have the right to vote. Because why we ask this question is because this is the way to see how each state see incarcerated people as citizens. And see them as part of society. So to answer your question is for the point of view of Prison Insider is the importance to have the access to everyone to the right of vote, including those convicted for any offense, is to the way to see them as part of society and not for democracy, it's very important. This is something very important that you also highlight in the report that I really thought was interesting. There was a lot of very interesting things, but at the end, you recall the international standards, the international human rights law, and this is very, very important to recall in different contexts, including in the US.
Thank you so much, Carolina. And Trey, a question to you as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll do three quick reasons. The first is I think just to your point, Carolina, would bring the U.S. In compliance with international human rights law. The right to vote is protected. The International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. It's a treaty the U.S. has signed, and so it's binding on the U.S. and states in the U.S. And right now we're out of step with that. And the International Convention to End Racial Discrimination. So all these other countries respect these bodies of international law. The U.S. encourages other people to oblige, and we don't. So I think that's one reason. The second is if you care about racial justice, these laws disproportionately impact Black and Latino voters. There's some information in the report about how there are, I think, 9 states now where over 10% of the Black population, adult voting population, is disenfranchised because of these laws. And you know, it's we didn't get into it too much here today, but we talk about it in the report. This goes all the way back to the end of slavery in the Black codes, and trying to maintain racial hierarchy after the end of slavery. So if you care about that, that's a reason to do it. And then the third is strategic, and the states that are decisive in terms of the presidential election and the communities that decide the outcomes of the Senate and the House, and then even at the local level, having more people who have been impacted by our criminal legal system and just more people who fully represent the community have the right to vote. That decides outcomes, and that allows us to elect candidates who will uphold our rights. And you can kind of do the numbers, but in each place, there's thousands of people who aren't voting right now who could have the right to vote and who could turn elections in a way that help us kind of advance all of our goals in terms of justice and human rights. So yeah, those are my reasons.
No, those are fantastic reasons, and thank you for referencing the racial caste system in the United States and why felony disenfranchisement expanded following the Civil War. So thank you for bringing that history into the conversation. Jennifer, same question to you. Why is guaranteeing the franchise for people completing their sentence inside of prison important to democracy?
I think that it sets up a mindset for a person if they're guaranteed inclusiveness. You're going to see the trickle down of including someone in society along ways, in a lot of different ways. If you tell somebody they don't belong, then you're going to see a completely different outcome. But I think that it really frames that person's mindset going back into the community, whether they're going to say, yes, I'm a part of this community, I want to do good, and I'm going to, I have a say. Or if you're going to tell somebody they don't belong, then they're going to maybe go the different direction. And that's unfortunate. I think that everybody that's in this country needs to feel like they belong to something bigger. And that's why.
Very important words there. And Checo, last answer to you before we turn to the question in the Q&A. Why does guaranteeing the franchise for people completing their sentence inside of prison, why is that important for democracy? You're muted. You're muted, Checo.
Whether we realize it or not, this upcoming election is very, very important. And getting people involved, and when you read your report with the Sentencing Commission Project, I mean, if people would just read that and understand that voting is a fundamental right. And I remember one of the judges came and testified at one of our hearings in the Capitol and said, I may have sentenced a person to 3 years, but I never sentenced that person that they never could vote. So it's a teachable moment to make sure our democracy we can defend democracy, because we all know that the prison industrial complex is real. That's where they make money. So if we can teach our people the importance of getting out and vote. We just did a conference that the significance of civil engagement, and our 4 points was to ensure that your diverse voices are heard. Also to ensure that the economic impact of what this is going to do to our families and friends and everything. And also, you have to learn to hold elected officials accountable. So when you become a registered voter, you can hold that person accountable. I remember one of the senators that in 18 that voted for people like myself to get their voting rights back. He made a statement that stuck with me. He said, when people come and make an appointment to see me, the first thing I do is I check and see if they're a registered voter. And if they're not a registered voter, I sit there and listen to them, and then I push them a register, and I tell them, you need to go and register, because I don't really have to listen to you because you're not even voting. So that stuck with me, that you have to hold people accountable. And finally, that it empowers individuals by giving them a sense of agency to make sure that they have an opportunity to say who represents them. So, prisoners or former incarcerated people that are involved in this process, they become empowered. So democracy, and reading your report, I mean, it is this election coming up is very, very important. It's very personal to me, because since I have my voting rights now, there was a senator in Louisiana here that wanted to have a bill to take my voting rights because they're saying that you shouldn't have the right, but you make me pay taxes. So I want my voting rights. So if we get involved, and everyone that's on this webinar today, go back and read the out of step report. When you read that report in depth and you look at people from across the water that have a right to vote and being empowered, and here we are in the United States of America, and they don't want us to have our say so. We have to get involved because democracy is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you. And so we have time, we're going to go a little bit beyond the hour because democracy can't be slowed down with the enthusiasm of the panelists we have in this conversation this afternoon. So we are going to go to some of these questions in the Q&A, and I encourage people, if you did have a question, to share it in the Q&A box. But the first question up is, what, in your opinion, this is to the panelists, does a voter engagement model look like that centers the lived experience of formerly incarcerated people? What does that include? And how would you recommend engaging folks who have experienced incarceration? Checo, I feel like you have a lot of lessons to share, given the work that you've been doing in Louisiana. But Caroline, I also want to ask you this, given your observations in the countries that you've been working in as well. But Checo, we'll start with you.
I think first of all, you have to educate people of the importance. Educating people is very, and we started while we're in prison. So that model is still in prison to make sure that they get their families involved, but they got to learn that they have to be educated. There's so much more I want to say, but I'm just going to say, educate people. You have to educate yourself and understand that being a formerly incarcerated person, your voice does count. But I tell my elected officials that represent me, I bring 10 votes to the table. And you need those 10 votes because not only does my family vote, I have friends that vote, and I can let them know that you care or you don't care. So it's very important to start early, to educate yourself, and think back. We all went to civics class. Thank you. I hope I answered the question.
I think you definitely did. You have some helpful comments there. Carolina, have you seen voter engagement of people with criminal conviction status in other countries? And do you have any comments or perspectives to share in response to that question?
Yes, the involvement that I saw is, for example, in France, people who have been in prison and didn't have, it was more related to have the real access to vote, not related to the right to do so, but to have this right respected. And then when they saw the situation, and there's a situation of someone who was elected, a politician who had been in prison, and when he was out, he really started engaging in a lot of advocacy work because he saw the situation. So for me, I think it's what Checo is saying, and other people also saying in terms of information, to be educated, to know what is happening, to know what is happening in your country, in your state, but also in other place, and having this information, know exactly, because this is something that, okay, don't do to turn the face away of what is happening inside the closed facilities is a false easy way to look to different situations. So looking and knowing what's happening in terms of access to rights, including voting rights, is very important. I think it's a way to talk with people who have been incarcerated, to talk to know what is happening, is a way, and to inform people around you about what is happening is an important way. And it is also one of the main things that one of the steps that we are part of as Prison Insider.
Thank you, Carolina. And Jennifer, Trey, do you have any comments in reaction to those questions, into that question?
I think just organize people. You have to organize and door knocking even and just rallying and the more voices you have involved, the bigger the voice will be. The more people you get rallied together, the more attention you'll get. I think organizing and rallying is a good way to get information out.
Yes, Trey? No?
I think they
All
covered
right.
it.
All right, so last question here, and it sort of speaks to the time we're in, given the criminal conviction history of a former president, and I'll add in the criminal conviction history of the current president's son. I think this speaks to, given the breadth of incarceration and criminalization in the United States, that even the elites can be directly impacted by the criminal legal system. Do you all think that the conviction status of the former president and the current president's son provides a window into challenging felony disenfranchisement and helping to reset these questions in the United States and perhaps carve a path to end felony disenfranchisement, or to at least challenge felony disenfranchisement in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Jennifer, we'll start with you.
I mean, it's pretty amazing that we can even be having this conversation with Trump being able to run for president, because in my opinion, then we should all be able to run for president. He's definitely committed some felonies. So if we can have a felon in office, then this shouldn't even be a conversation.
Checo?
To myself, I have to agree with, I concur with you, Jennifer. I mean, it's almost mind-boggling that we have Donald Duck running for president, and he has 34 convictions. And that's the importance of voting. So I'm gonna have to make a point here. When Donald Duck said, I appointed 3 Supreme Court justices and I appointed 300 federal judges to permanent jobs. So what he's doing is, that's how voting is important, because now these people are in power because of the election and stuff like this. So he has an opportunity to appoint these people. So if he wasn't elected, he wouldn't have this appointment. So, that's why it's very, very important to get involved. And when I see Donald Duck running around with 34 felony convictions and he's still on the ballot, which one of our audience here now would even have that opportunity? And think about this, somebody donated $40 million for his defense. I never had that kind of money for my defense. And I'm not hard on that. I'm just saying, look at the times we're living in right now. So it's very, very important that we educate ourselves. And as I started out, educate, organize, and then you can mobilize. You're going to take my voting rights away, but you're going to let someone that's been convicted and have 34 convictions, and he can run for president.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't understand that. I mean, it's way beyond, I don't understand.
Yeah, well, I'll as we wrap up, I'll let everybody in the audience know that the Sentencing Project is a nonpartisan organization, as are the other 501c3s represented here. We didn't get into the partisan speech today. I think what we talked about was in response to a question around the elite, including the former president and the current president's son voting, and some colorful language describing them. So, but just wanted to reinforce that, of course, Sentencing Project is a 501c3 organization and we are nonpartisan. I do want to thank our panelists. I am so grateful to you, Jennifer, to you, Carolina, from joining us way past. I don't know if it's past your bedtime, but I know it's way later where you are than it is here in the Mid-Atlantic. And to you, Checo, and to you, Trey, for joining us this afternoon. You know, we're going to continue this conversation. It is a year of democracy. The United States is nowhere near done, given the conversation that's going to play out through the general election and beyond, given what might happen come this November. Stay tuned, everybody in the audience, to be engaged with the Sentencing Project, to be engaged with Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, our state partners out in Minnesota, and vote in Louisiana, because there's activism happening, there is civic engagement happening, and we are in the middle of an ongoing conversation, and we hope that this work contributes to your awareness and the awareness of others that you're going to be connecting to in the coming weeks around democracy and protecting democracy by making it inclusive, including the persons completing their sentence inside and outside of prison and jail, who are represented by the more than 4.4 million who are locked out of voting, but we're working to expand the vote and expand the franchise. So thank you to everyone who joined us, and stay in touch, and we'll be following up. Take care.